So here we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Selvin Ortiz, and today we're talking about CSS Grid. So my special guest is Tim Smith, and hopefully he'll be able to provide some insight into that awesome technology. And I also have a couple of other guests with me. From the left, Sherry, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sherry Alexander. I've been a front-end developer for about 20 years now and have been just delving into craft in the last few and enjoying it a great deal.
Awesome. Andrew?
I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
Awesome. And my special guest today, Tim.
Hi, I'm Tim Smith, and I'm a designer and front-end developer, and I'm here to talk about CSS Grid.
Awesome. And you are a man of many talents and interests, Tim. So I kind of wanted to dig into those before we get into CSS Grid, because you recently started doing a lot of cool stuff in your YouTube channel, doing some tech reviews and other stuff. What kind of got you started on that?
I don't know. I think I'd been searching for some type of creative outlets that I could do on my own. I had done podcasts in the past and really enjoyed it. But one of the things that is very difficult about doing a podcast, kind of like this one, and you'll probably agree with me, is the fact of scheduling, right? Like scheduling guests is really, really difficult. Making sure that everyone's going to be there when you need them to be there. And thankfully, I mean, I didn't have a lot of cancellations over the years that I did a show, but I wanted something where the output of the show or the output of whatever I was doing was not dependent on other people. I could do it all on my own. I could do it on the time that I wanted to do it. If I want to, I can record one of my YouTube videos at 10, 11, 12 midnight, and that's okay because I'm just doing it by myself. So the schedule is very, very adaptable to what I need. And I think that's what really drew me to starting doing YouTube. I think the other thing was I had been very shy about being in front of a camera for a long time.
Yeah.
I thought I had more of a radio face.
Same here.
But yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed it, and it's been fun to talk about things that I like. I love technology. I love to talk about it and talk about its flaws and the great things about it. And that's been very fun and rewarding. I also do a couple of movie reviews, and I love to talk about movies, so that's been fun as well. And right now, that's currently what I'm doing. I'm doing a little bit of product reviews, a little bit of movie reviews, but I'm sure as time goes by, I'll branch into other things and find what it is that I'm good at and what it is that I really, really, really enjoy doing. But right now, this is what I'm doing, and I'm really enjoying it.
I watched your Minions movie review, and
Okay.
I read one of your retweets on there, and you said, "I watched the movie, so you don't have to." that was like, oh, cool. Okay, I'm not gonna watch it. No, the reason I asked about that is because I'm also interested in sort of photography and film myself. I have a background in photography, haven't practiced much in it. And I know Andrew Welch actually has some background in photography as well. So the thing about like what I like to talk about oftentimes doesn't necessarily tie to the topic as we're doing here, but it's the things that I enjoy, right? And I think as developers, we tend to like not really highlight some of those things. Like we kind of feel shy about some of those things that we're trying out. And I mean, I'm very much trying this thing out. I mean, it's from many aspects, it's been a failure, but I've enjoyed it. So photography, I think it's a really great medium for me as a developer who works a lot on the back end to kind of get inspiration. Like this is one of the primary reasons why I try to get out and go fishing, because it exposes me to like new areas, and it also makes me kind of vulnerable because we go on this little boat, and I have a 14-year-old stepson who's like 6'4" and not very good when you're in that tiny little boat,
Yeah.
So But I think it's like having a creative outlet, especially for someone that works a lot
Yeah.
on the back end side. I think it's really important. And you've done a lot of writing, like you've started a lot of projects. And
Yeah.
the second to last guest we had on the show was Wes Boss, and one of his things that kind of stuck with me is that he said that he likes to make it a thing, like whatever it is that he wants to do, whether it's starting a new podcast or starting a new course or selling stickers or whatever. He likes to make it a thing, and this is something that I feel I haven't done enough in my own projects, and especially when it comes to the back end and the front end, right? Because today we're talking about CSS Grid, but I'm barely getting through Flexbox and understanding Flexbox.
Right.
Now I have to understand CSS Grid. So why don't you give me your take on what CSS Grid brings to the table, and maybe that can serve as the starting point for the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I've given a talk called "Let's Learn CSS Grid" at a few different conferences, and this is really where a lot of my knowledge has come from, is doing research on CSS Grid for this talk. And one of the things that I like to make clear from the outset to anybody that asks me about CSS Grid is that it is not a replacement for Flexbox. CSS Grid is not a replacement for Flexbox. It's not a replacement for floats even. It's not a replacement for multi-column. These are all still layout tools that we can use within our projects. CSS Grid just allows us to use a grid without hacking our code,
Sure.
right? Because the thing is, we've been using Flexbox wrong, and I think we all know by this point that we have been using floats wrong for a long, long time, right? We've had to come up with hacks like ClearFix, for example, so that columns understand the height of each other, and so that that doesn't get messed up. Also, the thing with floats and with Flexbox is that we have to understand how much space something is going to take up, right? So whether we're doing our widths with pixels or with percentages, all those widths have to be calculated together with whatever margin we want to put in between those columns. You could use padding, which is what I've used in the past as well, but then you run into problems if you have one column that has a background, for example. Then what do you do, right? So CSS Grid comes to rescue us really from a lot of these bad habits that we've gotten into and we've gotten so used to, and also the fact that some of these things were so complicated that we had to come up with CSS frameworks like Foundation, like Bootstrap. These are things to facilitate the work that we've been doing for years, because I mean, making a grid with floats is a complicated thing, especially as your project scales, right? So this is where CSS Grid really, really helps us out. It allows us to do grids easily. It allows us to do responsive grids easily. It allows us to put space, or as Grid calls them, a gap between columns easily without any complex end-child selectors or anything like that. Or without, putting negative margin on either sides.
Right.
All of these different things that we've kind of come up with to address our main concerns are now gone with CSS Grid, because it was built to create grids. I think the biggest difference that I've noticed between Flexbox and CSS Grid is also the fact that CSS Grid is one-dimensional. You're doing one-dimensional layout. You're either doing layout in a row or you're doing layout in a column. Right? Whereas Grid can do both. It can do both row and column at the same time. And that has been, revolutionary, I think.
Sure.
So yeah, there's a lot of things about CSS Grid that just is going to make our life so much easier, is making our life so much easier.
That's fantastic to hear. So I'm coming from, I do front-end development, and I write a lot of CSS, and I use frameworks and do some from scratch stuff, and I've used Flexbox. I started using Flexbox within the context of a framework that uses it behind the scenes.
Right.
To me, it's like one of the things that you said is, it's not replacing Flexbox, it's not replacing floats, it's not replacing those things. So one of the things that I struggled with at the beginning was, okay, so where does it fit? If I already know how to create a grid with floats, with Flexbox, and what is it that I replace? And maybe you can speak to that.
Sure.
But for me, it was as simple as, okay, so basically I use Grid to create my layout, and within each of those containers that I'm going to put things in, I can use whatever I want. Floats if I'm crazy, Flexbox if I'm modern, or whatever. Now,
there we go.
You can elaborate on that a little bit, and maybe there's something in there for us to be able to, since you've already answered, okay, it's not replacing these things, so what's its place?
Yeah. So yes, so that's a natural next question, right? If CSS Grid is not replacing these things, what does it do?
Right.
So the big thing is that it is replacing the hacks that we've created.
Okay.
And by that I mean when we're using floats to create a grid for our layout, we are hacking floats to make it work that way. The original intention behind floats was to float an image around text.
Okay.
That is still a perfectly reasonable and useful way to use floats.
Yep.
Whereas instead, if we're trying to make columns and things like that, we should probably be using Grid. Flexbox is the same way. If we want something that is completely in one row, like the example I like to give is, for example, a header with a logo, let's say a search bar and some navigation, that's still a perfectly good use for Flexbox, because we're trying to put something all in one row. But CSS Grid allows us to create grids that are outside of that, right? So kind of like you said, we would use Grid to lay out our page, and then inside of those different containers, we'd probably use Flexbox or maybe a grid inside of Grid to lay out other things. We could also use floats to float images around text if that's what we need. So that's kind of how CSS Grid will help us with certain things that we're still doing right now. If I were to give you an example, I would lay out my page with CSS Grid and then use Flexbox inside of the header container, for example, or use Flexbox inside of the footer to arrange things inside of there, depending on the situation. But at this point, I'm laying out most of my page with CSS Grid.
So let's take a hypothetical example of something that we tend to do a lot. Say an image gallery, right?
Yeah.
So an image gallery is one of those things that seems to lend well to be within a grid, right?
Right.
What approach would you take? How would you use Grid, Flexbox, floats to do that, to accomplish that?
So I've done some of this with my own personal site, because I did a grid for my portfolio page, for my portfolio index page.
Yep.
And basically what that is kind of like an image gallery. And I'm using Grid to create the spaces for each of those different boxes. Okay. But then inside of those boxes, I wanted all the text to be at the bottom of each container. And I'm using Flexbox to do that. So each image has text inside of it, and I'm using Flexbox to make sure that the text resides at the bottom of the container. So that's a simple way that I've integrated both CSS Grid and Flexbox together in the same project.
And you didn't make any use of floats in this particular design or in this particular layout that you created?
No. I mean, these days I'm not really using floats for much. I don't find myself needing to float text around images all that much.
So is it safe to assume that while CSS Grid doesn't replace Flexbox or floats could potentially be phased away, primarily because Flexbox can do some of those things better, and support has increased over the past few couple of years.
I would still say no, and the reason for that is that float. So if you float an image to the left and the text is in the same container that image is in, that text will automatically reflow around that image.
Okay.
And you can't really do that with Flexbox.
Okay, makes sense. So we're really talking about looking at the primary function of each of the elements that we've used to create grids, such as floats, which you mentioned or you explained what its original intent was. With Flexbox, it has its own purpose, and then CSS Grid has its own purpose. So now we can basically use elements in the way that they were intended to be used, and then we get rid of the hacks.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So let's go to the next question then, because I think this one is probably going to be the most important one. We when we heard about Flexbox, Flexbox was going to kind of replace everything, right? Or like at least we thought that, okay, this is just going to be, we can do everything in there. And while we can create decent sort of grids with Flexbox, obviously we have a new kid on the block.
Right.
So back then, when Flexbox support wasn't all the way there, it was one of the things that we were wondering, like when can we use it? What is browser support like for Flexbox? So now that we're kind of a little bit, that's kind of behind us a little bit. What can you tell us about CSS Grid and its support across browsers, platforms, etc.?
Yeah. So I'm looking at Can I Use right now, and it looks like it's supported in Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, iOS Safari, the Android browser, as well as Chrome for Android. There's partial support in Edge and IE 11, and Edge 16 will actually bring full support to Edge. And the date for that one is... I don't know the date for that one, but that should be coming out soon as well. I don't foresee CSS Grid coming to IE at this point anymore. But that's the current support. So globally, that means that we have 70.75% support. And then in the US, that would be 79.43% of support. Okay. So the numbers are pretty good right now.
Okay. And if you were a betting man, how long would you say that we will get closer to like the 95% mark kind of support across? And you mentioned also, let me kind of drop that question for a second, because you mentioned you don't think CSS Grid is coming to IE.
Yeah.
Why is that? Are they not? Do they do not want to support CSS Grid? Or are they coming out with their own way, or what's happening there?
Well, the thing is that Edge is supposed to be replacing IE.
Oh, gotcha. So, okay.
So as people move to newer and newer PCs, Edge is the one that comes on their PC. So
gotcha.
That's why I don't foresee them adding CSS Grid to IE 11. I could be wrong, but I don't see that happening.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. So obviously CSS Grid is not a some sort of JavaScript API. It's not something that can be polyfilled.
Okay.
If there isn't 100% support, and you want to ensure that you cover at least some basics, like maybe a IE 11 which doesn't have support, is there any way to like hack it together, or are you left with maybe doing style sheet switching, or like if those browsers that currently don't support CSS Grid or only support it partially, if that's important to you, are you better off not implementing grids right now?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think this is a mentality that we have to get ourselves away from.
Okay.
A mentality that we need 100% or 95 or whatever number it is that you want to put to it.
Sure.
Support for a particular feature. because that is the assumption that all browsers are going to display the website exactly the same.
Right.
And it's just not a reality. It's never been a reality.
Right.
So, I actually think Rachel Andrew, who has talked extensively about CSS Grid way before I even started learning about it, has written articles about this before. She has an article called, "Is it really safe to start using CSS Grid layout?" And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. She also has another article called "Browser Support for Evergreen Websites." And in both of these articles, she kind of addresses that idea, which is, the web is an ever-changing place. Wanting 100% of support of a feature, or wanting two browsers to look exactly the same, is never going to happen. So we should be using tools that allow us to do the best work that we can, and try to use simple fallbacks for other browsers that just don't support it. The common ways that I've been telling people is feature queries. Feature queries are an excellent way to create support for browsers that do not support CSS Grid. Another way is to use the cascade to your advantage. So we understand that the first rule is going to be read by the browser. And if that is the one that they want to use, then it's going to use that. But then we can put other rules below it so that other browsers will accept that. So for example, we can put first display flex, and then we can put display grid after it, so that browsers that do not support grid will just use display flex. And then browsers that do support grid will just use display grid because it's the last one in the cascade.
Okay. I think that's a very good answer to a very complex question. And you mentioned that trying to reach for the stars is really not like something that you should be doing, right? In terms of like a specific number. Now, one of the things that I have a little bit of experience with is building for specific target demographics, which is, unfortunately, it has its ups, but it also has its downsides. And so think about having to build something that a complex UI to be used within a corporate intranet, right? Now, this is kind of a sort of isolated example, or I guess an edge case when we're talking about evergreen browsers and that sort of thing. But if you have to build, say, some sort of dashboard for something that it's going to be primarily used at a corporate intranet, where they might still be using IE8 with Internet Explorer 7, or I mean, not Internet Explorer 10 or 11.
Yeah,
we're talking about at that point, you aren't really talking about reaching universal support, like 95% universal support, or not even 80. You're really talking about covering this primary use case. Even though this is kind of an edge case, and you outline what you would do if you wanted to have the greatest coverage of essentially having having a fallback, like, okay, let's go with flex, let's go with grid. I think that kind of answers a strategy to let you kind of globally go a certain way. But I know that the definition for Flexbox and the definition for CSS Grid, in terms of like how to create the columns or whatever, because Grid has like grid template and a bunch of other definitions, the FR unit and all that kind of stuff. So when you do feature queries, in the case where your primary audience is going to not be supporting most of the features, would you at that point say, okay, let's just fall back? Like do we go back to kind of like the HTML? Like in HTML, we still say like, okay, like we can do all kinds of things with HTML emails, right? But if we're building HTML emails, we have Outlook, which is a pain. So we end up having to write HTML that we wrote in the mid 90s, right? So in edge cases where your primary demographic may not have, may only have partial support or none at all for CSS Grid, or even Flexbox, would you at that point say, well, your target demographic, you just don't deal with that because there's no easy way to have a good fallback without having to write a lot of code that kind of depends on, is this available, is that available?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty specific edge case, right?
Right,
So,
right.
I mean, if let me just tell you right now, if you're having to build websites for IE8, and that is what you do, you know, first of all, my deepest condolences for you. But second, yeah, I mean, there's no point in you using CSS Grid. There's no point in you using
Flexbox,
even Flexbox, because Flexbox isn't supported in IE8. So at that point, you know, you have to decide, as the, you know, developer, the designer, what it is that you're going to use. And yeah, I'm sorry.
So
This type of stuff doesn't really apply to you if you're working on IE8.
If I could piggyback off of that, I mean, you mentioned the global coverage stats as well as the United States coverage stats. The other thing I would want to add to that is that those may or may not apply to you. If you have an existing website, something that I do is look at Google Analytics and see who is actually coming to the site, right? Because the people who are actually visiting my site may be very different from what the US coverage is, for instance. You know, a couple of my sites are not seeing even close to the Internet Explorer traffic that I should be seeing based on global stats, for instance. So that's just something I wanted to mention, that we can look at if we have that kind of historical data in terms of who visits our site. That can also influence what our actual coverage needs to be.
I think that's a great point. And obviously, I don't want to be that person that, you know, that drags us down to have to, you know, like build for the lowest common denominator. But the hope is that we feel good enough that we can just not care about really old technology or having to build for those. If we're focusing on having to support a specific version of a browser or whatever, obviously we're going to be charging a lot more money if they're harder to work with, and we're going to be okay with not using cool stuff. So,
well, one of the other things I would say as well, for anybody that might be supporting browsers like IE8, IE9, IE10, is if you have if you have communication with your client, talk to them about the security risks that are involved with using browsers that old at this point. Not even Microsoft is supporting them.
right.
Microsoft is not issuing any security patches for IE8, 9, or 10. So it's, you know, it's kind of, you, if you want to, you can just say like, hey, not even Microsoft is supporting him. I'm sorry, I just can't. I'm not going to do this.
Right.
I can't do this for you, because that's a big deal too. Not only because it's easier for us and for the work that we do, but for them. You know,
right.
they also need to get with the times. So.
I totally agree, and I think that's, you know, it's a good sort of, I think it's a good starting point for us, and I know people in the craft community, a lot of designers in the craft community are beginning to feel comfortable with cutting out some old technologies. And as we see more, you know, frameworks drop support for some of those, because if we're using JavaScript libraries and they're saying, well, we're only going to support, you know, IE11 and whatever other browsers. So I think that we can kind of feel comfortable with moving forward. So in terms of,
we got to kick the horses off the highway, right?
right. Because we got to be part of the solution and push forward rather than always sticking behind. So,
yeah, one way that I usually couch it to my clients, Selvin, is that it's really kind of the tyranny of the minority. Like, do we want to make our site better for the vast majority of people visiting the site, or do we want to dumb it down for the lowest common denominator? And that's really going to depend on who the site is intended for and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the, you know, I talked to people that build basically software in the cloud. So they build software for, they want to have the greatest coverage in terms of support, right? Like people like Intuit, you know, people that build stuff for Wells Fargo corporate intranets and even Outlook 365 or whatever. Like I can only imagine for some of the things that they have to build, like what process are they going through to be able to say, okay, we have to do it this way, but we have to implement these features, and we know that if we have access to Flexbox or CSS Grid, it's going to be much nicer, and it's going to play very, very well with React or Vue or whatever. And I've had those kind of conversations with them, and a lot of those are like one particular set of people that are building this kind of software in the cloud to make it available to clients, and they want the greatest coverage. Like, that's one group. And the other group is that these companies that work at the enterprise or corporate level that have to build corporate intranets, and they still have to build the same kind of web-based UIs and other stuff, but they have to do it with the constraints of whatever that company supports. I mean, people at Wells Fargo are still using versions of IE 10 and 11, and they don't enable any kind of automatic updates, and they have all that kind of stuff. Now, having said all that, like, we don't have to worry about that, right? We're talking about a specific set of designers or developers that we deal with our own clients. We have the ability to dictate our terms in terms of contract. Like, we can kind of pick our clients and design, with the latest technology. So in this case, we don't have the constraints that we have with corporate intranets or software in the cloud. We're talking about building modern websites that support the latest technology. So how do we do it in a responsible way so that we're able to use those new technologies but have some sensible fallback? Because even though we can cut out IE 11 or whatever, what steps can we take to make it so that it's not a pain to build, and we have a sensible fallback in the event that CSS Grid isn't supported? And Tim, you kind of mentioned, well, like Flexbox, CSS Grid, and you can kind of build with what's the word that we often use? Modern. It's I don't have it with me right now, but like, you have to build for the most modern, well-supported browsers, and then kind of fall back. What's that, Andrew?
Do you mean progressive web apps?
That's right. Progressive enhancements, in that basically we're building. Yeah, we're building for like, we're building with modern technology in mind, and then we kind of fall back so that our local client, with a photographer, or our local, construction company that's, that's a local
it's
client.
always the CEO or the CFO. They're running like IE 7.
Right.
So it's always.
Right. And by the way, like, I'm not trying to make the case against CSS Grid. Like, I'm trying to learn about techniques that people are using, because I believe that, we can dictate our terms when we're working with clients, and we can educate ourselves on how to use the latest technology. I just feel like oftentimes we don't do it in a responsible way, right? In a way that it's not going to take a ton of extra effort, or it's not going to make it difficult for us to say, okay, these few browsers have issues with this. We can just patch it with these kinds of things. So in light of that, Tim, what things have you encountered working with CSS Grid that would allow us to think in terms of, use the latest technology, learn how to use it? Here are some kind of fallbacks that you can use, some techniques. Here are some tools that can allow you to build better with it. Maybe a chance for you to kind of shed some light on that kind of on that aspect of CSS Grid.
Well, I think I talked about this a little bit earlier when I said that the ways that we can use it is to use feature queries to fall back for browsers that don't support it. The Cascade is another way that we can take advantage of being able to use Grid for browsers that support it, using other alternatives for browsers that don't support it. And that's kind of the way it is right now. I don't believe that there is a polyfill for it at all.
There is one, but it hasn't been updated in a while.
Yeah, and even if it had been updated, I would normally not suggest using a polyfill anyway, because it adds unnecessary JavaScript to your project that you could just use CSS for.
And when you talk about
to fall back.
When you talk about feature queries, are we talking about the native feature queries in CSS3, or are we talking about Modernizer or something along those lines?
Yeah, so native feature queries where you'd say @ supports, and then you put the property that you want to make sure that the browser supports. In this case, what I've done is @ supports display grid, and if it does, then I put in my grid code there.
And what is the support for @ support?
@ supports has amazing browser support across the board.
Okay.
The only one that does not support @ supports is, I believe, IE11. And you know what? Let me check here. Can I use feature queries? Yeah, so it's not supported in IE11, but other than that, is supported in Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, iOS Safari, Opera Mini, Android browser, and Chrome for Android.
All the evergreens.
Yeah.
So for people that are somehow watching the live stream or join the room and are more of the back-end orientation, I think that feature queries are similar to function exist, in that you check for that function before you use it. And I just kind of wanted to, you also mentioned, let me see, in addition to feature queries, you said the cascade. And
Yeah.
obviously, I mean, that's a huge part of CSS, right? Cascading style sheets. Can you elaborate a little bit on that particular case? Say that you're building an image gallery with, an image gallery with 3 rows and 4 columns, and you use Grid to build it, but there's one browser that doesn't have Grid. How would you go about using the cascade in that case?
Yeah, so you would build. You could write a fallback with Flexbox.
Okay.
That you put earlier in the file. So what you would do is you'd put Flexbox related styles first, and then you would put your grid related styles last, so that a browser that supports Flexbox will use those styles, and a browser that does not support Flexbox would at that point it wouldn't use any of them, because if it doesn't support Flexbox, it definitely doesn't support Grid. Right. So if a browser doesn't support Grid, it would use the Flexbox rules first.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. No, and that makes perfect sense. I think that we're talking about targeting the exact same elements to create the exact same layout in either Flexbox or CSS Grid if supported.
Yeah, and you see, and that's also something that I've tried to get away from as well.
Okay,
is the layout doesn't have to look the same.
Right.
If I built the layout in Grid, I'm not about to recreate that again. Okay. Using something else. What I'll do is I'll do a simple fallback where it still looks fine, but it's not the same. And that's perfectly okay.
That's exactly what I do too, is I have fallbacks that at least it doesn't look like crap. I mean, it's not going to look like
exact
thing, but it's at least usable. And for the, whatever the percentage is that hits it, at least they can access the site.
Yep.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I guess we can go into kind of like the next topic, where I'd like to know if you're aware of any sort of frameworks that are already incorporating CSS Grid to some degree.
Yeah, I don't believe so. I don't know for sure, but I think the idea of CSS Grid is to get away from frameworks.
Sure.
Yes.
With CSS Grid, we don't need the framework to create our grids. CSS Grid is the framework.
Gotcha.
So I think the idea is to enter into an era where we build all of our grids from scratch, so that they serve the exact purpose that we want them to serve. And the really cool thing, I think, is that creating a grid with CSS Grid is very, very simple and was written in a way that we want to. I think that we'll want to create our grids again. It's pretty easy and quick to do it once you've learned the new terms and the new properties.
Gotcha. We had a link come in from Sherry here. She points out that there is a grid fallbacks cheat sheet by Rachel Andrew, the author who you mentioned earlier on the show.
Yeah.
Do you know of anybody else that say that we heard enough that CSS Grid is something that we want to get better at and we want to start building with? Who should we follow on Twitter? Whose blog should we read? What should we be looking at?
So the ones that I really recommend is Rachel Andrew. Rachel Andrew was the first to be talking about CSS Grid. I believe she started talking about CSS Grid back in 2014.
Okay.
When almost none of the browsers supported it. Only I think like Chrome Canary supported it with a flag behind the flag.
Okay.
So like super early adopter.
Right.
And she's talked extensively about CSS Grid. Another one who's been doing a lot of work with CSS Grid and really talking about it with a lot of people has been Jen Simmons. I definitely recommend you read the things that she's written about it, as well as her examples. She's got labs.jensimmons.com, where you can find tons of different examples where she's using CSS Grid. For me, it's been kind of like the old web all over again, because I've gone to those examples and like opened up my dev tools and examined exactly how she's created these wonderful layouts. So those two wonderful ladies are the ones that I would recommend to read and to follow to be up to date.
Okay. And
the other big thing, sorry to interrupt. The other big thing I would say is also to read the spec. Many of us do not read the specs on the W3C, but I've read the grid spec, and it's not the most entertaining thing to do, but it's very, very educational, and will show you the ins and outs of the feature. So,
what's the most interesting thing about the spec?
Well, the spec gives you details on how everything is supposed to work. Together with examples, right? Okay. So that's why I find the spec very interesting, because the spec goes over things that maybe people who are writing about it or talking about it maybe overlook, right? Okay.
Okay.
Just to address your original point again, Selvin, about what frameworks are going to use this, I definitely agree with Tim that frameworks, they originally started existing primarily to provide columns and layouts and kind of stuff that was missing. And as stuff that was missing gets added to the actual browser supported spec, honestly, the reason for using a framework kind of diminishes it,
Well,
yeah.
Maybe. Let me push back a little bit, because I agree with you, right? If I used to use Bootstrap and Foundation for the grid itself, I can easily switch back. In fact, since I don't know if you guys are familiar with this Suzy. It's a build your own sort of framework in SAS type of thing, right? Where it just basically takes care of calculations for you. I'm a big fan of that library. I don't use it as much anymore, but I really like the fact that I can go in and create my own little library that's specifically designed for grids, right? And I can use floats or whatever I want, and I'm familiar with that. So in a way, that became the replacement for a lot of the sites that I was building where I was using either Bootstrap or Foundation or Bulma or something else, primarily because of its grid. But the thing is that many frameworks bring a lot of other stuff to the table that we as designers or developers would arguably want to do it ourselves, right? Like button styles and forms and all that kind of stuff. Now, where do you fit between the all from scratch or not always, from scratch, where you basically not from scratch or don't repeat yourself kind of thing. When it comes to, libraries, because look at Foundation, look at Bootstrap. Yes, they include a grid, but they also bring a ton of stuff that can essentially give you a lot of stuff. And sure, there is a great case to be made against them, but I think that we're kind of reaching the point where, okay, you know what? We can replace the grid with, our own. Like, we can just use this and build our own grids. What do you do about, potential sliders, some sort of like forms and like those kinds of things? Would you like to see a world where we have like micro frameworks where we would basically have, form styles that you can bring in, through SAS, or even just for buttons, because there are some already out there. And this happened in the JavaScript world, where we have these massive JavaScript libraries, and all of a sudden we started to have like more focused micro frameworks, where we had a ton of libraries that only did Ajax request, or libraries that only did modals or only sliders. So obviously, the greater goal, or the ideal result, would be that CSS Grid would allow us to replace frameworks to the point where we don't use the grid that they implement. But what about the other stuff? If we were the kind of people that wanted to use some of those free features like form styles and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you, because I'm of the mentality that the sliders and forms, like you said, should be patterns that you create on your own, that you create as part of a design team. We've seen a shift from creating custom designs every time to this mentality of a design system, of a pattern library in many applications and sites. And I think that that's the way to go, where you create patterns that are best for the project that you're working on, instead of relying on patterns that may have been used for something else, or kind of like the default, a new default styling for everything. I really think it's better to create things on your own that you implement into your project. I think grid is going to be one factor of that, like you mentioned. It's going to be one factor of it, right? Because then hopefully we'll start creating grids on our own. But I think as an industry, we should also be moving to creating things that are custom to our project, are custom to our application, that we've done research on, patterns that are going to be good for our users, that we've done also extensive research on. That way the web doesn't look so much the same as it does right now.
But isn't the fact that they're patterns, isn't the point that they repeat themselves in some way, that there is shared commonality?
Right. But there's a difference between patterns and visual sameness.
Okay.
And that's, I think that's the differentiation that I think we've tried to make, where yes, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to, but every tire doesn't have to look the same.
Sure.
And I think that's what we're getting to is yes, there are patterns that users recognize because they've seen them in many other different places. But I think the idea is that we've reached this visual monotony because of some of these frameworks that we're trying to get out of. And that's where I think each team, each app, each product, each website, their team of designers should have an active role in making their website look unique to the brand that they're building for, even if it uses the same type of pattern or flow.
Sure.
We're trying to get away from that visual sameness that has come with frameworks.
Okay. Right. And if I could add to that, certainly there are places where frameworks can be useful. Not everyone has a team of designers. Maybe it will give you the jump start on creating a simple site for an individual freelancer. But we already have reached the time where there are micro frameworks out there. Like, I can get a CSS framework that has just form controls in it. or just forms, and I can use just that in there. But I think the time framework, a lot of the larger frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation, when you find that you're spending more time trying to hammer them into what you want them to be, versus using what is there by default, it's the time to consider not using them at all. Many projects years ago I was involved in where I spent more time coding overrides to Bootstrap than doing anything else. I said, well, why the hell am I using this to begin with? And I think there are lots of projects that will reach that point. Now, there always will be a time where there's some kind of atomic thing that we're going to reuse, right? For instance, fonts. You could make the argument that, well, we should design every font from scratch because, it should reflect the individual. But at some point, it just gets ridiculous. Let's just pick from a wide library of fonts and use this particular piece. So from that point of view, you could consider fonts as a micro framework that we are using on our sites. And there may be other pieces that we will use as micro frameworks, but overall, I agree with Tim that building a pattern library and that thus coming up with essentially a style guide for the project that you're building is really the way to go. And I mean, I think frameworks will always be around, but I do think that they will be less and less used, and will indeed devolve into micro frameworks or even componentized stuff that we just kind of just pick and choose what we're going to use, as opposed to a monolithic, Bootstrap or Foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what we're really talking about is that we want to reuse structure. We want to reuse the structure, or at least some sort of the containing layout, but we want to have a custom style in a way, right? So we look at something like Polymer. We look at things like components for JavaScript libraries, where really. We take if you look at in the JavaScript world and Vue components, they're built in a way that they give you everything that you need. They give you the structure and the functionality, or they give you structure and behavior, which is essentially the purpose of HTML and JavaScript, right? Structure and behavior, and then CSS kind of gives you the visual appeal. So I think that I'm definitely not advocating in favor of massive, CSS frameworks. But I think that, there's a case to be made to reuse, to be able to clearly document styles, to make it easier to work within teams, to be able to explore methodologies that really helps us prototype something faster that will already be self-documenting in terms of style guides and that sort of thing, but will give us the greater flexibility to customize everything about it, right? And we've seen some things like that. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Techians. I know Andrew is, and Techians is this, like, to be honest with you, it's kind of like a weird, like, it had a weird impact on me when I'm like, who wants to build like this? Who wants to use this cryptic sort of abbreviations and just have like hundreds of them in the elements? But over time, I started to read more, and it's just, it's like it's one way to think about something that we haven't thought of for a long time. And I think that what you bring to the table is you're pushing us to think in terms of, not just doing the same thing over and over, but being smart about, structural reuse and, sharing those kinds of things without building the same boring web, right?
Yeah. And again, that's why I said it is, we should be reusing patterns, but not necessarily styles, right?
Yeah.
The biggest example that I always bring up with people is a credit card form, for example. I feel like all credit card forms should allow spaces between each 4 numbers. I feel like all credit card forms should automatically select what type of card you are trying to input. I think all credit card forms should have the space where you can type in the month, and it will automatically switch over to the year for you to input the year. Those are usability patterns that we should be reusing over all websites, I think, because it makes it easier. Right. But how it looks should be dependent on however you want it to look. right?
Are
It should match whatever brand you're building.
Are you are either of you familiar with Stripe Elements?
I'm not.
Stripe Elements are actually pretty cool. That, obviously you're familiar with Stripe. I'm pretty sure. I think most of us are familiar with Stripe, and they have a really nice way for you to take credit cards. But they I don't know how recent this is, but they have a way for you to sort of integrate with their JavaScript API, and you basically get to build out the input stuff. It kind of speaks to what you were talking about, like the following sort of the pattern of what input capturing should look like for a credit card, and similarly for capturing routing, like an e-check or something like that. Like you could get creative doing, like. Visually, you can get creative, but you can reuse the patterns of, you're gonna need a routing number, you're gonna need an account number, the back name should already be figured out for you, etc. So I think that's pretty great. So what we can say though for sure is that if you are building a boutique kind of style site where it might be a landing page where you need an intricate layout and then lots of little sprinkles of visual appeal throughout, you might be able to do away with all the big frameworks and just use Grid as your foundation and then build everything else from scratch following patterns, right?
Yeah.
What tools have you used to build with CSS Grid? And by that I mean like if you're doing any work with React JS or Vue.js in the JavaScript world, like Chrome comes with like DevTool add-ons, right? Like the Vue dev tools and things like that. And I am aware of Firefox that has the Grid Inspector. Are you aware of any other tools that aid in the development with CSS Grid?
I'm not. The one that I use the most is the Firefox Grid Inspector. Okay. Because it's amazing. It'll show you the grid. It'll show you the gutters. It's a really great way to develop with Grid.
Fantastic. Which is your editor of choice?
I use Atom.
Okay. Yeah. Does Atom provide any sort of plugin or anything else that kind of helps you build with CSS Grid, or just snippets, that sort of thing?
No. It does autocomplete for some of the new properties, but other than that, not much. No.
So let's say that I'm somebody that has been working with Flexbox for a little while, and I've read a little bit about CSS Grid. How would I get started? Where would I get started? Where would I go first? Would I start?
So I can recommend two different things that I think will help. Rachel Andrew has a video series called Grid by Example, which you can find on gridbyexample.com. It's a whole slew, you know what I mean? Of tutorials that she recorded. They're on YouTube. They're screencasts. What I did is I subscribed to the playlist and then I just watched them on my TV. You can do whatever's convenient for you. Also, I did a workshop back in, I want to say January or February. I don't remember exactly when, but it was a 2-hour workshop on Grid and how we can use it for some simple layouts, kind of like an intro course into Grid. And you can email me for that, and I can provide that to you.
Okay.
Yeah. If I could add one that I really enjoyed, it's cssgridgarden.com. And it's a set of examples that uses a garden as a kind of the basis. And you interactively add and solve problems, and it visually shows the layout using Grid step by step. And it's a fun, easy way to do it. You don't have to sit there and watch a video, uninterrupted. You can play with it as you have time and actually see the results of the stuff you're doing. So
that's
cssgridgarden.com.
I wonder if that's a tip of the hat to.
What's that?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I wonder if that's a tip of the hat to the CSS Zen Garden.
I was just gonna ask about that. Did you guys ever build anything for CSS Garden?
It's by the same people that did Flexbox Froggy, which is Frogger.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They gave me that stuff. Yeah.
Actually, I just found it a really fun, interactive way that you can learn how to do CSS Grid.
Coming from you, that's a pretty big that's a pretty big endorsement right there, Andrew.
Is it really?
It is.
It's funny how gamifying it can kind of make it more compelling.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of us kind of have the want to compete either against other people or ourselves to do better. So Tim, do you have any final thoughts for some of us that are going to dip our toe into CSS Grid in the near future?
My final thoughts is usually just, start using it today.
Okay.
Find something personal that you can use it with, play around with it, and start using it today. Whether it's for practice or whether it's for production. I've used CSS Grid in production. No clients have complained yet, so.
That's good.
So I think it's okay. But yeah, just my biggest thing is just to use it today. Start learning, use it today. And the reason why I say that is just because I remember I really held out on learning Flexbox, and I regret that because Flexbox changed my world, and CSS Grid is going to change our world as well.
That's fantastic words to end with. Does anybody else have any questions, either in the room here, someone that might be not showing their camera, or are we good to call it a day? Let me see who else we have here. Okay, I think we're clear. So Andrew, you have any final thoughts, or Sherry?
And the only thing I would say is that this is a never-ending problem or thing to keep in mind, is that whether it's Flexbox or Grid or whatever the next thing is, I mean, there's always going to be something new to learn and implement.
Yep.
And I definitely agree with Tim that, especially when it's coming from a standards body that this is going to be adopted, the earlier you get on board, usually the better. Not just because you should be using the new cool thing, but because the industry is going to move to it, and it's going to save you time and allow you to do cooler stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. Sherry, final thoughts?
I'm just hoping that CSS Grid really kind of fires up and enthuses some of the designers that I work with, because it's always nice to be the dev who says, yes,
right,
I can do that.
It's
like, say no far too often.
Yeah, no, that's true. I could, I work on the front end and the back end, but I tend to be on the back end side a little bit more. Like, I enjoy that work a little bit more. And it usually takes me a little bit longer to kind of move on to the, newest and upcoming kind of, like with Flexbox. Like I said, I didn't really start using Flexbox in production till like a few months ago. So it's like, it took me a while, but that's kind of like the dev side. You need to entice us somehow. You need to find what we're building a lot of. Whether if we're working on the back end and we are feeding data to some UI that someone else is building and we have a relationship with them, tell us how understanding CSS Grid is going to help us have a better relationship with this designer that's struggling. So
yeah, it's one of those things that keep a mental note of how many times that you've adopted a new technology and said to yourself, God damn, I wish I did this 6 months ago. It would have saved me a lot of time. And then at some point, even someone as pig-headed as me, you learn, you know what? I should probably just do this so that in a year, I'm not saying the same damn thing about Grid.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be honest, like talking to people, like in the past, we've had guests that talk just specifically about education and creating content. People that talked about, Vagrant, Homestead, and Docker. Yeah. So like DevOps, design or whatever. And what I've learned, or what I realized, is that I have kind of like a renewed sort of energy to try to learn, because even though I've tried to read a book every 60 days, like I'll pick up a new book and try to do it. I think it's always good to try to be excited about something, to try it out. And when you have the resources and where to go to learn, I think that in itself is so valuable, because a lot of people are writing about it. CSS Grid is something that a lot of people are writing about it, and oftentimes you'll come across resources that might just put you back or keep you from it keeps you from learning something that just isn't quite clicking, and that's happened to me. So talking to someone like Tim about that and getting some references to resources, I think that's been really, really useful. So, Tim, it was an honor to have you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for getting us excited about CSS Grid, and for letting us know to just start building it right now, because I think that's going to be something that I personally will have to do. And thank you to Andrew and Cheryl also for joining us on camera. And that's it. So, Tim, any final thoughts at all? Do you want to go fishing sometime? Did you guys know this guy actually lives about probably 20 miles from me, and he's been so busy that we haven't actually connected, but we got to go fishing sometime, man. No,
I just thank you for having me. I appreciate you inviting me.
Where can people find you?
You can find me on my personal site, ttimsmith.com. I'm also on Twitter as SmithTimmyTim.
Okay.
And awesome. That's it.
Well, thank you so much to you and everyone. We'll see everybody else in the next one.
Thanks.